Yeah, sorry about that. I made you host. I should have made you co-host.
Okay, Paul, would you like to do the introduction?
Yes, so today's speaker is Joe Cornwall, who since the last time we saw him in November of last year with an excellent presentation about USB-C, has since retired. Now, his position was technology evangelist, but somehow I have the feeling he's not quite finished being a technology evangelist. And so today we're going to hear all about content protection. Joe, take it away.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And yes, you are 100% correct. I am now the technology evangelist at large. So rather than just representing one company, I represent the world and explore all the wonderful things we're doing with AV. And of course, today we are going to talk about HDCP. So let me set this up so that we can share the screen here. And you are now seeing my screen, correct? Did I do that right? Okay, let's get started. So let's talk about HDCP, high bandwidth digital content protection. You might have think that we've kind of come as far as we can come with this thing, but it has changed and it's going to become even more interesting in the future, because one of the things about HDCP is up until now, it has not been associated with broadcast or over the air. This also includes things that are OTT, such as a Netflix or something like that. But we're going to see HDCP deployed on a lot of these platforms. So really understanding what HDCP requires, what it entails, what it covers, very, very important for us to do. So let's take a look at this. And the first thing I want to kind of just reiterate is it is high bandwidth digital content protection. It's got nothing to do with high definition video. It can actually be deployed on any kind of digital content. And that was the original intent, was to prevent illicit copying and distribution. It was something we tried in the analog days with this thing called macrovision, but that was a complete waste of everybody's time and really just made things complicated. A lot of people might say that about HDCP as well, but as you'll see, we actually have a couple of different HDCP permutations that we have to deal with. So high bandwidth digital content protection, of course, designed to prevent illicit copying and distribution. Let's take a look at a few of the things. It is all about this idea of using a key authentication and key change, right? So your receiving device, your display, has a key and it says to your transmitting device, your source, hey, I'm legit, you can send some information to me. The whole idea behind this is to prevent illicit man-in-the-middle recording. You can't cut that wire and start recording it with something else. That's what this is really designed to do. It's very important for us to recognize that once the receiver is authenticated and the transmitter encrypts that data stream, anything that breaks that communication loop will cause it to shut down. And in reality, that's been the biggest problem with HDCP, is trying to mix commercial products that don't have HDCP, or even bigger deal is let's try and put in a device that requires HDCP, even if the content is not HDCP encrypted, right? A lot of manufacturers just went, we're not going to worry about the content. We're just going to make the device require HDCP, which is now pretty much standard across all PCs. We went through this, of course, with a lot of the Mac devices that had problems back with iOS 9 and 10, right? So once the key is in place, revocation will prevent any of those devices from receiving or cloning the data. Now, the interesting thing about this is this was put into place quite a while ago, and it really wasn't very successful in the beginning. It was more complicated and less successful. Let's kind of take a look at that, because this sets the tone for where HDCP is taking us in the future. And it all started with this thing, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act of 1998. So really, this is kind of when this was put into place. Understanding that we were moving into a digital world. And by the way, in 1998, digital video was really on the cusp of becoming reality. There was nobody who was even sure that we had an algorithm powerful enough to encrypt digital video, because there's so much data on it. So this was put in place by Congress as a way of preventing illicit copying in this prehistoric point in time when we were looking at this. And what it does is very important. It criminalizes any production or dissemination of technology, devices, or techniques that will circumvent digital copyright. There's precisely one entity in the United States that is allowed to circumvent the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and that is the Library of Congress. They can remove this encryption, but only they can remove this encryption, and only internally. The rest of us, we have to live with this, and that's really important, right? And here's an important part. It criminalizes the act of circumventing this access control. So as you look on your campuses and you look at your devices that are put in place, you really have to be aware of anything that's requiring HDCP. And it could be any device, from streaming music to streaming video to a digital book, for example, could potentially be encrypted with this. Getting that encryption out of the network, or decrypting this, can open up certain legal liabilities. And we have to kind of be aware of that. So here's where we're at. This is what I really want you to remember, right? HDCP is not about high definition. It's about high bandwidth digital content. It doesn't care what the content is. What it cares about is security. And the net is, once HDCP is in a system, it is illegal to remove HDCP protection anytime, any place, for anyone in essentially any country, because the Digital Millennium Copyright Act was signed up as a legal treaty. I'll kind of illustrate this, and you can hear my dogs detonating in the background here. So that's kind of fun. So one of the things that happened with HDCP protection, to just kind of give you an idea, many years ago, in 2008, there was a very large project that I consulted on, and there were about 100 different rooms, right? 100 different huddle spaces and conference rooms that were involved. At the time, I really strongly suggested, hey, you need HDMI, you need a digital connection, or DVI, in these rooms. It was expensive in 2008 and 2009, right? Those cables were a bit expensive. The company decided, no, we're not going to do this. They did everything VGA analog. Well, lo and behold, here comes 2012, and all of a sudden they throw up their hands going, oh my God, we're having these problems with HDCP. What should we do? IT director came up with a brilliant idea. Did a web search. Found out there was a thing called an HD Fury that removed HDCP. Bought them at several $100s a piece, bought a couple of hundred of them, put them in every room, sent out an email saying, look what I did, I fixed it, every room is working again. I didn't have a dog in the fight. I wasn't part of the integrator that did it. I was just really consulting on the project to give some ideas on how to do this efficiently. And the integrator is like, "What do you think about this? You know, let me just make a few comments, right?" And so I called up the folks that owned the project, and I was like, "Look, I don't really care what you do. I don't have a dog in this fight. But here's something to think about. You've wholeheartedly broken the law 127 times, and you're a very large corporation. And while I'm not going to say anything, that wouldn't benefit me or anybody, and your integrator's not going to say anything, the reality is, what if your competitor got this information? This could be very embarrassing." So naturally, I ended up with 200 HD Furies in my closet, because those were pulled out and we had to revamp the entire system. It's all about this. Once you've got HDCP, this is important. Once you have HDCP, you are in the HDCP world. But we're going to find out that becomes a benefit to us as we go through the rest of this training. So let's start with old HDCP, HDCP 1.4. And here's the thing to think about. HDCP 1.4 is exclusively and completely associated with 1080p, full high definition content, right? So this is all based on something called Blom's scheme. Now, Blom's scheme is an algorithm that was used in cryptography. It was actually deployed by the CIA in the 1970s. I can almost see the SMPTE meeting where they discussed this in the early 2000s, and an engineer saying, well, I work for the CIA and we use this thing called Blom scheme, and everybody else going, well, that's great, we can use that. Will it work? Oh, hell no, it's never worked. Great, let's adopt that as our standard. That's kind of how it went up with, right? So the way that it was supposed to work is your computer or device was supposed to have as many as 40 of these 56-bit keys. And your display or receiving device was supposed to have 40 of these 56-bit keys. Now, not many manufacturers deployed 40 of them, and that number was important because that limits how many devices can be connected in an HDCP cleared network, right? So you've got these things that have these keys at both ends. We couldn't really determine how many keys devices had. The transmitter device sends the key, but it's not like you have to match the two keys. They use an algorithm with prime numbers to create a third virtual number. If that third virtual number meets certain standards, then the system is authenticated. And it continues to do this in something called authenticate forever. Authenticate forever simply means that every 128 frames, roughly every 2.5 minutes, your system is re-authenticating HDCP. So pro tip number one, if you have a system and it's flashing every couple of seconds, the chances are you have an HDCP violation there somewhere. Something doesn't like what's going on. There's a firmware incompatibility. So this is all about 1080p. And this is associated with Blu-ray DVDs. It's associated, believe it or not, with new over-the-air broadcasts that we were talking about prior to this session that are associated with ATSC 3.0. It's associated with streaming content. This is where we've been up until now. And this is the system you cannot remove from your classrooms, conference rooms, or other spaces where you're going to be using this. Once again, it has nothing to do with the actual content being HDCP encrypted. Now the devices themselves are HDCP encrypted, as we all know. It is the smartphone, the tablet, the computer that's requiring an HDCP link, regardless if the content is requesting it. So we now live in this 4K world. So all of a sudden we had to come up with a better system for encrypting 4K, because the reality is Blom's scheme was old enough and porous enough that it was in place for less than 90 days before it was compromised. And we see lots and lots of bootleg DVDs because it's never really worked. And immediately you could buy a device for a few $100 to completely remove it. That wasn't as secure as we wanted. When we start talking about 4K movies, now we're talking about something that's approaching the quality of, or even surpassing the quality of 35mm film. This is truly master quality, right? So they had to be a little bit more careful about it. So they came up with HDCP 2.2. It is absolutely associated only with 4K and 8K content. This has nothing to do, if the content isn't being presented in 4K, an ultra blue 4K disc, streaming or broadcast 4K, downloadable movies in 4K, then HDCP 2.2 does not become part of it. Fortunately, most of the hardware will support both HDCP 2.2 and HDCP 1.4. Now keep in mind, for HDCP 2.2, for any of this 4K content to work, and let's say that we were putting together a film studies classroom in a university, you're going to want to be able to play this content in that kind of a facility, right? We have to have HDMI 2.0 or above every single link, a physical layer that complies with HDCP or HDMI 2.1 for this to be able to operate. So you're talking about very advanced connectivity first and foremost. It is a completely separate system from our old HDCP. In the same way that when we start looking at USB, and USB 2.0 uses completely different wires in the cable than USB 3.0, HDCP 2.2 has nothing whatsoever to do with 1.1. They are both unique systems that are operational completely on their own. Generally speaking, anything that can support HDCP 2.2 should be able to support HDCP 1.4. So you don't have to worry about these two systems. As if you're putting in a system designed for 4K, if it'll handle 2.2, you should be backwards compatible, although it's always good to check these things, right? So it should be compliant. When we go to HDCP 2.2, we're talking about 128-bit encryption algorithm, which was put out there by SMPTE, and it also has this thing called a locality check. And this is going to be one of the bigger problems in a large institution or facility is, depending on the size of the space, we have a certain, and I can't remember the exact number, 20 milliseconds or 17 milliseconds, whatever it is, it's a small number of latency between the transmitter and the receiver, between the source and the sink. And this translates to a couple thousand feet of wire. Well, that's great if you just have wire, but keep in mind there's latency in each one of the hops, in each one of the distribution amplifiers, in each one of the devices. Start adding that up. And the reality is it's really hard if you were working in something like a stadium or a very large, a really good example right here in Florida where I live, right? Disney owns theme parks. Disney movies may want to be played in the theme parks. Disney can't remove HDCP even though they own the movies. This is the law. So they have to put this in. Well, how do I run 2,000 feet of cable to a bunch of monitors that are in a theme park? This is why HDCP was created, right? So this locality check makes sure that everything is in the premise. It keeps everything in the building. And that's okay for 99.999% of the residential and commercial applications. But we have instances, and here it is, it says 7 milliseconds is going to be the link. And it comes out to a couple thousand feet of wire if we were just going at the propagation velocity in copper. All right, so this is HDCP 2.2. Let me kind of reiterate the two of them, give you sort of a look at what both of them are. HDCP 1.4, the old system, the system you're dealing with in your facilities today, designed for 1080p, only associated with 1080p, uses Blom's scheme, key authentication and exchange, 56-bit key, 40 locations, and generally a 2.2 system would be backwards compatible with this. Not 100% of the time, I haven't found any exceptions, but there may be. When we move to HDCP 2.2, this is designed exclusively for ultra high definition 4K and 8K content or devices like streaming players or OTA receivers designed to provide those kinds of signals. It uses an advanced AES encryption system that's operating at 128-bit, which makes it almost impossible to break this encryption. It's really quite strong. But it is a physical layer requirement. So everything in a system must be HDCP 2.2. And that means, once again, going to our theoretical film studies classroom that might be built on one of your locations, right? You can't just put in the same matrix switch, the same AV over IP solutions that you're using in other classrooms. Everything has to be compliant with HDMI 2.0 minimum. 2.1 is a much better choice in order for us to get HDCP 2.2. So we really have to redesign the physical infrastructure for spaces that are going to use HDCP 2.2. All right, let's get to the crux of the biscuit. I have HDCP 2.2. Can I manage this in a facility like a university, a college, a public school, or a public building? And the answer is, interestingly, yes. Turns out that legislators are not that smart. And they left a whole bunch of loopholes when they wrote this Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And basically it said you cannot eliminate HDCP. What it didn't say is you can't change one form of HDCP into another form of HDCP. So the very guys that created this HD Fury box that caused that problem at that project I told you about that started in 2008 created a new box, this guy right here. So this new box that they came out with, the Integral 2, is designed to take 4K 60 frames per second in 444 color space. So this is very wide bandwidth, and shift it from HDCP 2.2 to HDCP 1.4 to make it compliant with your installed technology base. Now, this was tested in courts, not by me, but the courts basically came back and said, hey, the law says you can't get rid of HDCP. This isn't doing that. This is converting it. This is legal. And it's a loophole. This device is available. It's $400 or $500. I'm not saying you should use it in your classrooms. Please do your own research on this. Find out what your own requirements are locally. But the reality is that this has been tested in court, and this is a way for us to manage, at least in the short term, how we can take a 4K content and present it over a 2K system when HDCP 2.2 might be in place. So that kind of gives us a short-term workaround using this device, and it's readily available on the internet, right? Keep in mind, what works for 1.4 is unlikely to work for 2.2. We can take the 2.2 and downgrade it to 1.4 legally, but what we can't do is eliminate HDCP entirely. So that gives us a lot to think about in how HDCP is managed. If that was all we had to deal with, then this would be the end of this particular presentation. But it's not. We actually had to make this more complicated because, well, this is the AV industry and it's entertaining to make things that barely work on any given day. So I think this is how most manufacturers look at it anyway. So here's what was proposed, this thing called HDCP 2.3. By the way, this is all Intel, right? That's who owns this whole thing. Digital Content Protection Organization, DCP LLC, is essentially Intel. That's who owns the chipsets for this. So they came up with this idea of HDCP 2.3. I believe this is the correct story, specifically for commercial type applications. Well, it didn't work the way we wanted it to, so we kind of redeployed it and it became HDCP 2.2 Pro. The idea behind this is we're going to provide the AV industry with an opportunity to send protected content to more devices than you can accommodate in a consumer environment. HDCP 2.2, really important, let's say for the home theater crowd, right? If I have a nice front projection system, Dolby Atmos, 73 speakers, and I built my room and I spent $50,000 on it, I want to watch really good movies. And we can do that. And then I can distribute it in my house to 3 or 4 other locations in my McMansion or whatever the case might be. Or you can put it in a classroom. What happens if this is Disney? What happens if this is SeaWorld? What happens if this is, a large facility or a university? How do we then deploy this and make this available over all of those? That's where HDCP 2.2 is put into place. And what it does is it eliminates a lot of the topology constraints regarding the device count and the depth of how many devices we can have, right? It gives us the ability to do HDCP repeaters. So first thing, this is deployed specifically on projects that are whitelisted. What does that mean? Well, let's say that you're building a new stadium or arena or whatever the case might be, or whatever project you're doing, and you want to have HDCP 4K, HDCP 2.2 compliance for this particular installation, and you're going to be doing multiple streams. It's going to be a sophisticated installation. Your project will be whitelisted by HDCP LLC. So you would apply and say, okay, we're a university, we're a college, we're a medical school, we're a law school, whatever the case might be. We are this, and we need to have this in all of these locations. They will whitelist it. They'll say, okay, you can distribute this information. You must be licensed to be able to install this and to buy the products that make this work. That's the whole point behind it. So you go to HDCP LLC, you pay a licensing fee, right? And you have the capability to make all of these things, right? So integrators must be licensed installers to be able to install HDCP Pro devices, and then they can only install those in authorized locations. The integrators have to agree to the terms, sign the HDCP licensed installer agreement, which is found on DCP's website. It's a $500 annual fee for the integrator, so it's not an out of line cost. I mean, it's a fair cost, I think, in that regard. And then once you've got that training and once you're certified, you're placed on the DCP's public list of licensed installers, right? And that could be a university, it could be your internal team, or it could be a contractor that you work with. HDCP licensed manufacturers cannot sell their devices to anyone who is not on that list. So if I'm making an HDCP distribution amplifier so that we can send content to multiple screens, you can't buy it unless you're an integrator or a facility that's on this authorized installer list and you're installing it in an authorized whitelisted project. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense, right? There's a lot of facilities that are available for this. You might be thinking, okay, this is only going to be for football stadiums or arenas or whatever the case might be. That's not true. The DCP has a number of categories of facilities and premises that they will allow this. Education facilities, hospitals, airports, shopping centers, yachts, commercial ships, airlines, commercial buses, right? A lot of different places. They're really looking at this saying, we want to have this in place. So there's a lot of things that are happening on HDCP 2.3, and it all comes down to you must be licensed and it must be in an authorized white space for this to operate. Minor hurdles, but it does require an investment of time and a little bit of training to be involved with it. So let's kind of compare a little bit of what's happening here in HDCP. And I think this is going to give you a better idea of what you get for your money when we start looking at HDCP 2.2. And keep in mind, every flat panel that we buy today is 4K. Most projectors are moving towards 4K. Most laptops and other devices, smartphones, are moving towards 4K. We're going to be in a 4K world. I personally think that 8K is silly. And if you start looking at Discus, you realize very quickly that we don't need 8K for spatial resolution. But 4K, I think this is real. And I think that we're going to be dealing with a 100% 4K world in the next decade. So if I were looking at projects, I would be saying, this is something we need to have as part of our structured solutions that we're going to have in our facilities. So let's take a look at what this means. First off, is the system network capable? Your current system is not network capable. That means I cannot take an HDCP encrypted, let's say Blu-ray, and put it through a video capture card and then send it out over my network to go to multiple monitors. I can't do AV over IP using HDCP 1.4. It is not allowed, right? It is not network compatible. HDCP 2.2, no problems. It is absolutely network compatible. And then we go to 2.2 Pro. Well, yeah, it kind of has to be at that point. The number of devices that we can have. This is based on the 56-bit keys and the number of keys that are in every device. Theoretically, HDMI 1.4 gave us 128 devices. It's a 7-bit system, very similar to where USB is. We never saw that many devices, nor have I ever seen anybody even remotely try to connect that many devices to it. We go to HDCP 2.2, it's a much more modest 32 devices that can be within this video network. In a residential environment, that's plenty. I mean, frankly, if you've got a house and you've got more than 32 4K TVs that are playing on this, you need to call me because I need to get in on that project too. We can make a lot of money on that one, right? That's somebody with big dollars. Reality is 32 is a lot, right? And it could be it can be a private residence to whitelist. So if you were working on a serious mansion, yeah, you could actually go to HDCP 2.2. When we go to 2.2 Pro, it is unrestricted how many devices that are there. So this would be for a university, a college, a public facility, or a theme park, right? We can now have 4K content playing on all of these screens wherever we want to have. So unlimited number of devices. How many levels can we have? When we start talking about the number of levels, let's take a look at what that means. The number of levels is the number of hops. I go from my source player, right? So I've got my player, and I might go into, let's say, if I'm doing HD base T, I might go into an HD base T transmitter, and then I might go to an HD base T hop to go a little longer distance, and then to an HD base T receiver, and then finally into my screen. So that would be, 4 or 5 hops. The maximum you can do with the old system, currently what you're dealing with, is 7 hops. We rarely get to that. The new system, much more restrictive. 4 hops. That's as far as you can go. Transmitter to distribution amplifier to receiver to display. Done. That's as far as you're taking it. But it's network capable. And what does that mean? If you look up on the top, it says content source. If I go into my encoder, that's 1 hop. Well, if I go into my network, that's 1 hop. It doesn't matter if I'm going into a network that has 15 switches that are stacked in 2 different IDFs on 3 different floors. None of that matters. It's 1 hop going into the IP environment. And then when we come out of the IP environment and into a decoder, that's another hop. So this really is designed for IP-based distribution, right? So it makes a lot of sense when we start talking about that. Once again, that is true of HDCP 2.2 Pro. It's unrestricted, and it's 4 hops with 2.2, including that changeover into IP. So you can use this even within a room if you're not doing this over the network. If you're using network switches to go to multiple displays for a video wall in a more sophisticated room, HDCP 2.2 will flow through that kind of a system. Leave join tolerant. Now we're talking about things that are more akin to broadcast switching. So I would be able to manage the system. In other words, if I have a very large space where I have a video wall, a multi-panel video wall, and then I have other monitors elsewhere, I can turn on and off those monitors with the content without having to reboot the system. HDCP 1.4, if I'm going to 3 different devices and I change the input on one of them, I can't go back without reestablishing the entire link. It would look like a man in the middle, and HDCP would kick us out. 2.2, 2.2 Pro allows me to be leave join tolerant. I can switch the content going to a display without interrupting the rest of the HDCP network. When I go to HDCP type 1 support, that simply is saying, is it backwards compatible, right? So yes, of course, it's going to be backwards compatible for this, and it is only available on whitelisted spaces for HDCP Pro. So this is something that I think you're going to be dealing with most probably at a university level, at a facilities level, is going to be we're either creating a single large, very high performance room, or we have to distribute this to a very large number of monitors, and therefore it's going to be whitelisted, and we should be working either with an HDCP certified integrator or have our own internal teams HDCP certified. Once again, about $500 a year. The application is online for that. That's really the essence of what we're dealing with in HDCP. I mean, it's not that complicated or sophisticated, but I think it's kind of interesting, the interplay between the two systems, the fact that you can downgrade from 2.2 to 1.4 legally. Once again, do your own research for your facilities. I'm not a lawyer, but I do know that this was covered in a lot of the journals and a lot of the magazines and a lot of the media that it was done, right? So a lot of the things that are there are readily available for us to be able to use in these kinds of installations. That's really the core of what I wanted to present. And now I just kind of want to leave this open. What kind of questions, comments, what do you think? What do you need to know about this that I might not have covered?
Good morning or good noon, I guess now. I'm Jacob with University of Minnesota. My challenge is, and first of all, thank you for this information.
Pleasure.
And learned a lot here. So my issue that I'm running into is that we are dealing with uh, content that gets essentially flagged as HDCP. And maybe you can clarify if I'm not stating that correctly. My understanding is a device is looking for max, for example, often what we're dealing with that all we're doing is a PowerPoint presentation, and we're connecting to a system that might have multiple displays or even one display, and it doesn't like something in the signal chain, and it flags it as DHCP. That's the issue that we deal with most often. We are not displaying content that is, I think, subject to this. It's getting like what seems to be false positives, and therefore we get shut off of a recorder or whatever, but it's not protected content. It's a person's PowerPoint. Can you
Jacob,
speak to that a little bit?
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up, because it is something that I kind of alluded to at the beginning of this, but I need to go into a little bit more depth on it. Here's what happened, really. This is the best way I see it. This is my interpretation. So let's go back a few years, right? We have digital video. All of a sudden, we have to protect this thing. We put in HDCP. Well, the problem is, I'm playing a DVD through my computer, and it's supposed to flag that content as HDCP. But if I'm using that same computer and I'm showing you a PowerPoint presentation of my own graphics, my own photographs, my own words, it's not HDCP encrypted. Why would it ask for that? Along the way, and I don't know this to be a fact, but I'm going to kind of put it out there anyway. I think Apple was one of the first companies to do this. Certainly, they all do it now. I'm not saying any one company is responsible, but I think Apple kind of was the first one to fall off the tree, to use that metaphor. They said, you know what? We don't want to be in a situation where something is HDCP encrypted and our device can't pick up on it and allows it to be copied. So we're just going to say, you know what, in the 21st century, everything's got to be HDCP compliant, or it won't play, and we don't really care if you have a problem with that. That was sort of a hardware manufacturer decision, because I guess it's a little challenging to have this thing turn on and off, and it would become a real problem for consumers who can't quite understand what they're seeing here, right? Like why is it working sometimes and not working others? Why is it working with a 480p DVD and not a 1080p DVD, or something along those lines? So they kind of made it hardware requirement independent of the content. And that's where we run into a problem. So we may end up with laptop manufacturers, their device requires an HDCP channel, even though the content does not require an HDCP channel. And that means that we should be testing our systems for HDCP compliance, regardless of whether we intend to utilize this or not. Here's where the bigger challenge, I think, comes, and we haven't seen this manifest yet, but we're kind of at the beginning of this. What happens when everybody's laptop is designed to operate in a 4K world? Do we then have laptops that are looking for an HDCP 2.2 link? I don't think so, but I don't think we're moving away from 1.4. So I think we can manage a little bit of that with the Integral 2, which takes HDCP 2.2 and dumbs it down to 1.4. But anytime that you're dealing with any device that's being brought in, every system has to have that HDCP 1.4 compliance. And to be 1.4 compliant, we have to really think in terms of every single endpoint, whether it's a transmit, receive, or a matrix in the middle, HDMI, audio, de-embedder. All of these devices that handle this signal, if they can't pass that information of HDCP, and normally HDCP flows through with HDMI. So for example, if I have an audio de-embedder, that should not be a terminus for the video signal. In other words, the HDCP should flow through to the display, even though I'm stripping out the audio at that point. But depending on the manufacturer and how they design the system, we may have some issues. So the way to get around this is, first and foremost, let's make sure that we're airtight on HDCP 1.4, because the reality is this entire content protection system was created for specific kinds of content, but hardware manufacturers have now shifted it and said, you know what, we're not going to play with different flags and content. We're just going to make the device require this. The same thing is true with over the air, whether you're watching a cable feed, whether you're watching Netflix or something like that, streaming ABC, NBC, whatever the network might be, or true over the air broadcast. Those all have broadcast flags for HDCP also. At this point in time, those are not turned on. But at some point in the not so distant future, I expect we're going to start seeing those content flags initiated. So this is going to be even a more important and probably a more intrusive challenge for those of us in the AV community. Hope that helped to answer your question a little bit. Anyone else? Well, I guess we've kind of explored a little bit of HDCP. Gave you something to think about anyway. So just so everybody knows, I am retired. I guess technically I'm unemployed, happily unemployed at the moment, spending time with my granddaughter and maybe do a little fishing this afternoon. That said, I'm still an AV guy, AV technology evangelist. I'm wearing the shirt. If you want to reach out to me if you have any questions, AV_educator@outlook.com. That's how you'll find me. And I intend to be a part of this industry for many more years to come. So I might be retired, but I'm not going to disappear.
Well, we really appreciate your training today, Joe, and appreciate you taking time for us. And I know I learned a lot. I'm also I'm gainfully unemployed, but it's still very interesting to me. And I know what you just presented would really be helping. Really going to help us out as we design the system. So very much appreciated.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
And if there's no other questions, then we will let Joe go. All right. Thank you. I'm going to end recording here then.